Welcome back to Fall Asleep 2. Before we begin tonight's journey, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and I'd love to know. Comment below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, let's settle in, get comfortable, and begin. The Crusades, a series of religious wars that spanned nearly 2 centuries, remain one of the most dramatic and complex episodes in world history. While the term typically refers to the campaigns waged by European Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule, the Crusades were far more than that. They were a convergence of faith, politics, ambition, and desperation. A clash of civilizations that reshaped not only Europe and the Middle East, but also the entire medieval world. To understand the Crusades, we must begin not in Jerusalem, but in the heart of Western Europe, in the cold, grey stone churches and feudal courts of the 11th century. By the year 1000, Europe was emerging from what historians often call the Dark Ages. This period saw the decline of central authority after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the rise of feudalism, and waves of invasions from Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens. But by the 11th century, things were beginning to stabilize. Agriculture improved, populations grew, and with them came a renewed interest in trade, learning, and religion. The Catholic Church, led by the Pope in Rome, was asserting itself as the central spiritual authority across Christendom. For the average person, life was deeply tied to the Church, not just in faith, but in law, education, festivals, and even daily routines. The idea of sin and salvation permeated every part of existence, and there was no higher goal than to secure one's place in heaven. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of the Roman Empire, still stood strong, though not as powerful as it once had been. Based in Constantinople, it was a hub of wealth, culture, and Orthodox Christianity. And to the south and east of it stretched the vast lands of the Islamic world, governed by powerful caliphates and sultanates, rich in knowledge, commerce, and military strength. Tensions between these worlds were simmering. In the 7th century, Muslim armies had conquered Jerusalem, along with much of the former Byzantine and Persian territories. Though Christians and Jews were often tolerated under Islamic rule, they were subject to special taxes and restrictions. Over time, Christian access to the Holy Land became more uncertain and politically sensitive. But the immediate spark that ignited the Crusades came in the late 11th century, when the Seljuk Turks, a Muslim dynasty from Central Asia, began expanding westward. They dealt a crushing defeat to the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, seizing much of Anatolia, which had once been the empire's heartland. The Byzantine emperor,
desperate and humiliated, sent a request for help, not just to his neighboring Christian rulers, but to the Pope himself. This was a turning point. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at the Council of Clermont in France. His speech that day, though preserved in different versions, carried a singular, powerful message. Christendom was under threat, and it was time to take up arms. He spoke of atrocities, some real, some exaggerated, committed against Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. He painted the Muslims as brutal oppressors, and he offered something that few people in medieval Europe had ever heard.
Before, a spiritual bargain. Those who joined this holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem would be forgiven of their sins and granted salvation. The crowd erupted in cries of Deus vult, God wills it. It was a rallying cry that would echo across Europe for generations. Word of the Pope's call spread like wildfire. Lords and knights, peasants and pilgrims all began preparing for the journey east. Some were driven by religious fervor, others by the promise of land, wealth, or glory. Still others by a desire to escape their debts, their crimes, or their hopelessness. Thus began the First Crusade. Not as a single organized army, but as a collection of ragtag forces, divided by language, leadership, and ambition, yet united by a single powerful idea: to take back the Holy Land for Christendom. But the First Crusade and those that followed would be anything but simple. What lay ahead was a saga of bloodshed, betrayal, courage, and cruelty. A tapestry of events that would forever bind the destinies of Europe and the Middle East. Let's begin this journey by following the earliest of these crusading forces and see what awaited them on the long and perilous road to Jerusalem. The year was 1096, and across the towns and villages of Europe, thousands were preparing for a journey unlike anything they had ever imagined. Some were armored knights, sharpening blades and swearing oaths before stone altars. Others were farmers, monks, bakers, and beggars, people with no military training, only the hope that their faith would carry them through. They were united by a single call, proclaimed by the Pope himself, to reclaim the Holy Land for Christendom. But the First Crusade did not begin with discipline or strategy. It began with chaos. Before any official army had been mustered, a wave of unorganized zealots surged eastward. This movement, remembered as the People's Crusade, was led by a ragged but charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, with a simple robe, a mule, and a voice that stirred crowds to tears. Peter traveled from town to town, declaring that the end times were near and that only those who joined the crusade would be saved. Tens of thousands answered his call. But these early crusaders were ill prepared for the journey that awaited them. With no central leadership, no provisions, and little understanding of the world beyond their villages, they stumbled through Europe toward Constantinople. Along the way, their piety gave way to something darker. In towns along the Rhine, Mainz, Worms, and Cologne, they turned their wrath on local Jewish communities, accusing them of killing Christ and hoarding riches. What followed were acts of unimaginable violence. Entire communities were slaughtered, homes were burned, the rivers ran red. These atrocities would mark the beginning of a pattern, a recurring undercurrent of hatred and fanaticism that would plague the Crusades for generations. When Peter's followers finally reached the Byzantine Empire, the Emperor Alexios was horrified. He had asked for trained soldiers. Instead, he received unruly mobs. Fearing instability within his borders, he ferried them across the Bosporus into enemy territory. There, in the open fields near Nicaea, the Seljuk Turks crushed them with ease. Few survived. Peter the Hermit himself fled back to Constantinople, shaken but still determined. The People's Crusade had ended in ruin before it had even reached the Holy Land. But the main crusade, the one that history remembers, had not yet begun. Later that year, the real military effort took shape. Several armies, composed of experienced knights and noblemen, began to march east. They came not as one unified force, but as separate contingents, each with its own ambitions. Godfrey of Bouillon, a devout and austere nobleman from Lorraine, brought a disciplined host of men. Raymond of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest lords in Europe, joined with his own powerful army. Bohemond of Taranto, a clever and calculating Norman from southern Italy, saw the crusade as a path to power. Alongside them came men like Robert of Normandy and Hugh of Vermandois, each carrying both pride and expectation. They gathered in Constantinople, where Emperor Alexios demanded oaths of loyalty. He wanted to ensure that any territory reclaimed from the Muslims would be returned to Byzantine control. Though many of the Crusaders hesitated, most agreed, at least in word. Suspicion lingered on both sides. The Latins and the Greeks shared a faith, but little else. Centuries of division and misunderstanding had left them wary of one another. In the spring of 1097, the Crusaders crossed into Asia Minor. Their first target was Nicaea, the same city where Peter's followers had perished. This time, the siege was carefully planned. After several weeks, the city fell. not to the Crusaders directly, but to the Byzantines, who negotiated a secret surrender with the Turkish garrison. When the Crusaders realized they would be denied the right to plunder, resentment grew. It was the first major sign that the unity of the crusade was fragile at best. From Nicaea, they pushed deeper into hostile lands. The march through Anatolia was brutal. The summer heat scorched the earth. Water was scarce. Food rotted. Men collapsed from exhaustion, yet they pressed on, enduring ambushes and starvation. At Dorylaeum, they were attacked by Turkish horsemen who struck swiftly and vanished into the hills. But the Crusaders rallied and pushed them back, proving that discipline and heavy armor could still prevail. Months passed. By the time they reached Antioch, many had died. And yet, Antioch was essential, a fortified city of immense strategic importance. The siege began in October of 1097. The Crusaders surrounded the city, cutting off supplies. But the walls were high, the defenders determined. Winter arrived, and with it came hunger. Rats were eaten, leather was boiled, corpses piled up, morale plummeted. Some considered abandoning the crusade altogether. And then a miracle, or something like it. Bohemond, ever the opportunist, had secretly contacted an Armenian guard within the city. One night, under cover of darkness, a gate was opened. The Crusaders poured in. Antioch was theirs. But just as they began to recover, disaster struck. A massive Muslim relief army approached. The Crusaders, still weak and scattered, now found themselves under siege. Inside the city, desperation returned, and then came a strange moment that would captivate the weary army. A monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed he had received a vision from St. Andrew, guiding him to the burial site of the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced Christ's side on the cross. He dug beneath the church floor and emerged with a rusted piece of metal. Many saw it as divine proof that God favored them. Others called it a hoax. But faith is powerful, especially in desperate times. The relic became a rallying point. In June of 1098, with starvation closing in, the Crusaders launched a bold attack. Against the odds, they defeated the larger Muslim force and secured their hold on Antioch. But the Victory came at a cost. Bohemond refused to surrender the city to the Byzantines, as promised. He claimed it for himself, declaring it the capital of a new principality. The unity of the crusade was unraveling. Nearly a year later, in the summer of 1099, the remaining crusaders, now reduced in number but hardened by trial, reached Jerusalem. The holy city, the final goal of their sacred mission, stood before them, controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate, It was heavily fortified and defended. The surrounding hills were dry, supplies were low. The Crusaders knew they could not wait long. They built siege towers from timber gathered in the countryside. They prayed, they fasted, and then, on July 15th, they launched their final assault. The battle was ferocious. Scaling ladders, flaming arrows, battering rams, all were hurled against the walls. And then a breakthrough. A section of wall was breached. The Crusaders poured in. What happened next remains one of the darkest moments in Crusader history. In a frenzy of bloodlust and religious fervor, they slaughtered the city's inhabitants. Muslim men, women, and children were killed. Jews who had sought refuge in synagogues were burned alive. The streets ran with blood. No mercy was shown. It was not a victory. It was a massacre. But to the Crusaders, it was a triumph ordained by heaven. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. They wept at the Holy Sepulchre. They gave thanks. And then they crowned Godfrey of Bouillon as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He refused the title of king, saying he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. The First Crusade was over. Against all odds, it had succeeded. But peace was an illusion. The blood had barely dried in the streets of Jerusalem when a new challenge emerged. Not of conquest, but of governance. The Crusaders, many of whom had expected to complete a holy pilgrimage and return home, now found themselves lords of a land they did not understand. The First Crusade had succeeded in its narrow goal. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. But holding it would be a different matter entirely. In the wake of the conquest, several Crusader states, known collectively as the Latin East, were carved out of the lands taken from Muslim control. These states were fragile, artificial creations, formed in a world that had not asked for their presence. The largest and most prestigious was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, centered in the holy city itself. To the north lay the Principality of Antioch, still held by Bourbon. Further north was the county of Edessa, the first Crusader state to be established, and to the south, the county of Tripoli, founded through further campaigns along the Levantine coast. These new realms were not blank slates,
societies filled with Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, Armenians, Syrians, and others. In some places, coexistence took root. In others, tension simmered. Latin rulers imposed their feudal structures over complex and ancient traditions. European settlers, known as Franks or Franch, brought their customs, their language, and their swords. Castles were built, tall, imposing, foreign. Some stood proudly on rocky hills, others perched near coastal roads or deep desert paths, ever watchful for signs of revolt or invasion. At the top of this new world was Godfrey of Bouillon, who had refused the title of king, but who ruled Jerusalem nonetheless. After his death in 1100, his brother Baldwin took the throne, becoming the first official king of Jerusalem. Baldwin
was a capable leader, pragmatic, stern, and ambitious. He understood that survival in the East required more than piety. It required alliances, diplomacy, and, at times, brutality. Trade resumed. Pilgrims continued to arrive from Europe. Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar, two military monastic orders, emerged to protect travelers and defend the Holy Land. These warrior monks took vows of poverty and chastity, but wielded swords with lethal efficiency. The Templars wore white cloaks with red crosses and headquartered themselves in what they believed was the site of Solomon's temple. The Hospitallers, clad in black with white crosses, began as caretakers of the sick, but soon became a formidable military force. For a time, the Crusader states thrived. Cities like Acre and Tyre became bustling ports. Local lords married native Christians. Markets bustled with spices, silks, and stories. But this fragile peace was always shadowed by war. To the east, Muslim leaders were regrouping. While the Islamic world had initially been divided, split among rival dynasties like the Fatimids of Egypt and the Seljuk Turks, the shock of Jerusalem's fall began to galvanize resistance. Jihad, the concept of religious struggle, was invoked not just in prayer halls, but in battle plans. New leaders emerged, determined to push the Franks back into the sea. The first true test came from the north. The county of Edessa, perched far from Jerusalem and surrounded by hostile territories, was vulnerable. In 1144, it fell to Zengi, a powerful Turkish Atabeg who captured the city and declared it a triumph of Islam. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves through Europe. It was the first major Crusader defeat. It would not be the last. When news reached the West, it was received not with despair, but with resolve. Once again, Christendom rallied. Once again, the cross was taken up, but this time it would be different. This time, kings themselves would lead the charge. What followed was the Second Crusade, a vast and ambitious effort to reclaim Edessa and reassert Christian dominance in the East. It would bring emperors and monarchs into the sands of the Levant and would end in failure, mistrust, and deepening divisions. But before that wave would crash, the Crusader states stood at their zenith. For nearly 50 years, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem and its neighbors had survived. A thin Christian veneer stretched across a deeply Islamic landscape. And though its kings wore crowns and its churches echoed with Latin hymns, the land beneath their feet never truly belonged to them. In the bazaars, Arabic was spoken. On the hillsides, minarets stood tall. And just beyond the horizon, the storm was gathering. When the county of Edessa fell to Zengi in 1144, it was more than just a military defeat. It was a symbol, a shattering of the illusion that the Crusader states were permanent. The loss of Edessa marked the first major blow to the Christian presence in the East, and it stirred deep concern across Europe. Churches held vigils, monasteries rang bells in mourning, and soon, from the pulpits of cathedrals and the courts of kings, a new call echoed through Christendom. The Second Crusade had begun. This time, it would be no collection of lesser lords and wandering pilgrims. This time, it would be led by kings, the mightiest rulers of their age. Chief among them was Louis XI of France, young, deeply religious, and tormented by guilt for his role in a church burning in Vitry. Alongside him would march the Holy Roman Emperor, Conrad III of Germany. A battle-hardened monarch with a vast realm behind him. Their goal was clear: to reclaim Edessa and restore the prestige of Christian arms. But noble intentions alone do not make for wise planning. The crusade began in 1147 with both monarchs taking separate routes through Europe toward Constantinople. Once again, tensions arose between the Western Knights and the Byzantine Emperor, now Manuel Komnenos. The Latins mistrusted the Greeks, seeing them as soft, subtle, and too friendly with the Muslim world. The Byzantines, for their part, saw the Crusaders as unruly, arrogant, and dangerously unpredictable. Conrad led his German forces across Anatolia first, but his army was decimated by Turkish attacks near Dorylaeum, the same battlefield where the First Crusaders had triumphed decades earlier. Harried by archers and betrayed by the terrain, the Germans suffered heavy losses. Those who survived staggered to Constantinople or sought shelter with the Byzantine forces. Louis VII fared little better. His French army endured a brutal winter, ambushes, starvation, and disease. Morale crumbled, supplies vanished, new figure was also beginning to rise in Egypt. A young general who would become the most legendary opponent the Crusaders would ever face. His name was Saladin. But before his sword would shape history, the Crusader kingdoms clung to their fragile gains. Jerusalem remained in Christian hands, for now, but the wind was shifting and the desert waited. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 sent shockwaves through Europe. For nearly a century, the holy city had been the jewel of Christendom in the East. Its loss was more than a strategic setback. It was a wound to the soul of the Christian world. From the smallest village chapels to the grandest Gothic cathedrals, prayers were offered and vows were sworn. A new crusade was no longer an option. It was a divine obligation. This time, the rulers of the West responded with unprecedented urgency. 3 monarchs, among the most powerful of their time, took up the cross. Frederick I Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II Augustus, King of France, and Richard I of England, later known as Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade was born, and with it, one of the most legendary episodes in medieval history. Frederick Barbarossa was the first to act. At over 60 years old, he was a veteran of war, a ruler respected across Europe for his strength and justice. He led an enormous German army across the Balkans and into Anatolia, determined to reach the Holy Land by land. But tragedy struck before he could even glimpse Jerusalem. In June 1190, while crossing the Salif River in modern-day Turkey, Barbarossa fell from his horse and drowned. His death shattered the morale of his forces. Many turned back. Others perished from disease and desertion. The Great German Crusade had ended before it had truly begun. Meanwhile, Philip and Richard took to the sea. Their journey was no less troubled. Richard had only recently become king, following the death of his father, Henry the charismatic and fearless in battle. He was a man of immense ambition, but he was also impetuous, often driven more by pride than diplomacy. He and Philip had a tense relationship. Old rivals, now forced into alliance, they travelled together to the Mediterranean, but once they arrived in the east, their paths quickly diverged. Before moving on Jerusalem, the Crusaders turned their attention to the city of Acre, a vital port on the coast of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It had been under siege for months by Crusader forces and was now a critical objective. When Richard arrived in 1191, he was suffering from fever,
but his presence electrified the camp. He took command of the siege with precision and fury. Engines were constructed, tunnels were dug, arrows flew day and night. After weeks of relentless assault, Acre fell. The victory, however, was darkened by blood. Thousands of Muslim prisoners, held as bargaining chips, became victims of Richard's impatience. When negotiations with Saladin stalled, Richard ordered the execution of over 2,000 captives outside the city walls. Saladin responded in kind. Mercy had given way to vengeance. Tensions between the Crusader leaders boiled over. Philip, already in poor health and frustrated with Richard's dominance, returned to France, leaving the English king to press on alone. Richard now stood at the head of the crusade, respected, feared, and unpredictable. He began to march south along the coast toward Jaffa, seeking to weaken Saladin's hold on the region. At the Battle of Arsuf, Richard's forces met Saladin's army in open battle. The fighting was
fierce, but Richard's discipline and timing prevailed. The Crusaders held formation under pressure and then counterattacked with devastating effect. Saladin's forces withdrew. It was a significant victory, but it was not decisive. Over the next year, Richard advanced closer to Jerusalem. Scouts could see the city's golden domes in the distance. But the weather, the supply lines, and the constant threat of Saladin's army made any siege a daunting prospect. Twice Richard approached the city. Twice he turned back. The decision not to attack Jerusalem has been debated ever since. Some say it was strategic caution, that Richard knew he could not hold the city even if he took it. Others see it as a missed opportunity, a moment when the crusade might have changed the course of history. Instead of storming the holy city, Richard focused on securing the coast. He captured and fortified key ports like Ascalon, and he began negotiations with Saladin. The two men, so different in faith and background, came to respect each other deeply. Saladin admired Richard's courage. Richard, though never soft in battle, recognized Saladin's honor and leadership. In 1192, the two leaders agreed to a truce. Under the terms, Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to enter the city freely and without harassment. The coast would be secured for the Latin states. The crusade, though it had failed to recapture the holy city, had preserved a fragile peace. Richard never saw Jerusalem. He left the Holy Land that same year, his health failing and his kingdom in danger. Captured and held for ransom on his return journey, he would spend the next year imprisoned. Saladin, too, was weary. He had defended Islam, preserved Jerusalem, and restored dignity to the Muslim world. He died in 1193, not in a palace, but in a simple home in Damascus. At his death, he had given away nearly all his wealth to the poor. The Third Crusade had ended. It had been a war of giants, of legends, forged in fire and faith. And though the holy city remained out of reach, it had also been a rare moment when even in war, respect could be found between enemies. But the peace would not last. If the First Crusade had been a holy pilgrimage, and the Third a clash of kings and warriors, the Fourth Crusade would become something else entirely. A story not of salvation, but of betrayal, greed, and destruction. It would be remembered not for its battles with Muslims, but for its shocking attack on fellow Christians, and it would leave a scar on Christendom that never truly healed. After the Third Crusade, there remained a deep desire among many in Europe to recapture Jerusalem. The city was still under Muslim control, despite the temporary peace arranged by Richard the Lionheart, and though pilgrims were allowed to visit, the idea of a Christian kingdom without the holy city was unacceptable to many. So, once again, the cross was taken up. Once again, thousands pledged themselves to a new crusade. This time, however, the crusade lacked strong royal leadership. The kings of Europe were entangled in other wars, political rivalries, weary from previous campaigns. Instead, the effort was led by a group of ambitious noblemen from France and northern Italy, men of high birth but limited resources. They needed ships to transport their armies to the Levant, and for that, they turned to the great maritime power of the age, Venice. The Venetians, led by their blind but formidable Dove, Enrico Dandolo, agreed to provide transport for the Crusaders.
A massive fleet capable of carrying thousands of men, horses, and supplies. But there was a price. When the Crusaders failed to gather enough funds to pay the Venetians, the debt had to be repaid in another way. And so, in 1202, the Crusaders agreed to help Venice attack the Christian city of Zara, a rival trading port on the Dalmatian coast. The city was under the protection of the King of Hungary, himself a crusader. Despite warnings from the Pope, who forbade the attack, the Crusaders laid siege to Zara and captured it, a shocking act of Christian-on-Christian violence. The Pope excommunicated them all. Still, the crusade continued. While the Crusaders wintered in Zara, A new opportunity arose, one that would take them even further from their original mission. A Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived in their camp. He was the son of a deposed emperor of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. He promised vast rewards if the Crusaders would help him reclaim his throne. Gold, soldiers, supplies, and most importantly, submission of the Eastern Church to Rome. All would be theirs if they helped him. The offer was too tempting to resist. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet set sail, not for Jerusalem, but for Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Christian world. The city was enormous, surrounded by towering walls, bristling with centuries of wealth, and deeply mistrustful of the Latin West. But in July, after a brief siege and a fire that destroyed part of the city, the Crusaders managed to force the Byzantines to accept Alexios as co-emperor. But the promised riches never came. The treasury was empty. The people of Constantinople despised their new rulers. Tensions boiled. Riots broke out. In early 1204, Alexios was overthrown and murdered. The Crusaders, now without a patron and facing hostility from every corner of the city, made a fateful decision. They would take Constantinople by force. On April 12, 1204, the Latin army stormed the city. What followed was a catastrophe. Constantinople, the capital of the Christian East for nearly 1,000 years, was sacked by fellow Christians. Churches were looted. Monasteries were burned, icons were smashed, sacred relics were stolen and carted off to the west. The great Hagia Sophia, one of the most majestic churches in Christendom, was desecrated. Horses were led into the sanctuary. A prostitute was placed on the altar, mocking the faith it represented. The carnage lasted for days. Thousands were killed. The city's treasures, collected over centuries, were destroyed or stolen. Latin knights paraded through the streets with golden chalices, priceless manuscripts, and jewelry ripped from corpses. The spiritual heart of the Orthodox world was broken. In the aftermath, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, dividing the Byzantine territories among themselves. A French nobleman, Baldwin of Flanders, was crowned emperor in Hagia Sophia. But the new empire was weak, hated by the local population, and constantly under siege. It would survive for only a few decades. The real cost of the Fourth Crusade, however, was far deeper. The schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, already strained by centuries of theological and political disputes, became a chasm. Trust was shattered. Bitterness rooted itself in the soil of both East and West. For many in the Orthodox world, the sack of Constantinople was not just a betrayal, it was unforgivable. And in all of this, the Holy Land was untouched. Jerusalem remained under
Muslim control. The crusade that was meant to reclaim it had instead torn apart Christendom itself. It was a turning point, a moment when the lofty ideals of the Crusades gave way entirely to ambition, greed, and politics. And though future crusades would be launched, none would carry the same spirit or success as the first. The crusading age was changing, and the world with it. The sack of Constantinople did more than just scar a city. It shifted the balance of power in the entire medieval world. The Byzantine Empire, long a bastion of Eastern Christianity and a buffer between Europe and the Islamic world, had been gutted from within. Its emperors fled into exile, establishing successor states in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, clinging to fragments of their former glory and vowing to reclaim the imperial throne. In the West, there was a brief flicker of triumph. The Latin lords, flush with the wealth of Constantinople, returned to Europe bearing relics and spoils, gilded chalices, fragments of the true cross, bones of saints, and sacred icons now displayed in churches from Paris to Venice. The West saw these as blessings. The East saw them as theft. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, created in the Crusades' aftermath, was never secure. Though the Crusaders had captured the city, they had not tamed the region. Greek resistance flared in every direction. The countryside remained hostile. The remnants of the Byzantine elite, powerful families with centuries of experience in diplomacy and warfare, regrouped quickly. They bided their time, formed alliances, and prepared to strike. Meanwhile, the rest of the Crusader world took little comfort from what had occurred. In the Holy Land, the Muslim powers viewed the sack of Constantinople with both amusement and relief. The Western Christians had turned on themselves. Their alliance with the Byzantines, however strained, was now in ruins. And without Eastern support, the remaining Crusader states were even more vulnerable. In Jerusalem, which still remained in Muslim hands, Saladin's successors maintained a delicate balance of power. The Ayyubid dynasty, though fractured after Saladin's death, still controlled Egypt and much of the Levant. They kept a wary eye on the remaining Crusader fortresses along the coast, but the threat of another major crusade seemed distant. The Christian world was now too divided to pose a serious danger, at least for the time being. Back in Europe, the papacy was left to reckon with a nightmare of its own making. Pope Innocent III had initially supported the Fourth Crusade, but the sack of Constantinople, a Christian capital, had not been part of the plan. When news of the atrocities reached Rome, the Pope was furious. He condemned the attack, excommunicated the Crusaders once more, and lamented the damage to Christian unity. Yet even he could not fully undo what had been done. The tragedy of the Fourth Crusade lies in its transformation. What began as a holy mission ended as a political conquest. What was meant to liberate Jerusalem ended by destroying Constantinople. The spiritual heart of the crusading idea to reclaim sacred lands for God had been replaced by worldly ambition and military greed. The consequences would echo for centuries. The Byzantine Empire, though eventually restored in 1261, would never fully recover. Its population shrank, its wealth vanished, its prestige, once unrivaled in the Christian world, dimmed to a flicker. When the Ottomans finally captured Constantinople in 1453, there was no Latin Empire to
Stop them, and no crusade to save it. By the early 13th century, the crusading ideal had been tarnished, yet still, Europe was not finished. Despite the failures, the infighting, and the moral decay, calls for new crusades would continue. Each one would be different. Some would be smaller, others would target new enemies entirely. But none would ever again carry the same force of purpose that had driven the armies of the First Crusade nearly 200 years earlier. And so the story turns toward new crusades, new defeats, and new complexities. The Holy Land still beckoned, but the road there would only grow darker as the ashes settled over Constantinople and the broken empire limped into exile. The deeper effects of the Fourth Crusade began to reveal themselves, not just in political realignments, but in the soul of Europe itself. The crusading ideal, once draped in the language of sacrifice and piety, was now openly linked with opportunism. The knight who once rode to liberate Jerusalem now eyed the riches of rival Christian cities, and the papal blessing that once came with solemn prayer now risked being seen as a sanction for conquest, not sanctity. In the newly formed
Latin Empire of Constantinople. Instability reigned from the beginning. Latin barons, used to feudal customs from France and Flanders, found themselves governing a Greek population that did not speak their language, did not share their rights, and did not recognize their rule. Cultural misunderstandings were everywhere. Latin lords imposed Western-style feudalism on a society still shaped by centuries of Byzantine bureaucracy and Orthodox theology. The Greek Orthodox Church, stripped of its patriarch and driven underground, became a vessel of resistance. Clergy continued to conduct rites in secret, preserving the traditions of the Eastern faith, while refusing to acknowledge the Latin patriarch installed by Rome. Resistance was spiritual as much as political. Churches and homes, in whispered prayers and secret liturgies, Orthodox Greeks kept their identity alive. And beyond the walls of Constantinople, Greek nobles and generals began the slow, steady process of reconquest. In Nicaea, the exiled Byzantine elite established a stronghold, the Empire of Nicaea, which over time grew in power and legitimacy. From this base, they launched attacks against the Latin occupiers, steadily reclaiming cities, villages, and hearts. Over the decades, the Latin Empire shrank. Its territory was carved away piece by piece. The Crusader rulers in Constantinople lived in splendor, but their realm was rotting from the edges. Creed suffered, alliances crumbled, the promise of a West-led empire in the East faded into illusion. Finally, in 1261, nearly 60 years after the sack, the Greeks returned under the leadership of Michael Palaiologos. The forces of the Empire of Nicaea launched a surprise attack on Constantinople. The Latin defenders, complacent and unprepared, were overwhelmed. The city fell with barely a fight. The Byzantine Empire was restored, but not as it had been. It was weaker, poorer, and deeply traumatized. The scars of 1204 had not healed, and they never would. For the West, the failure of the Latin Empire marked the end of the grand dream of uniting Christendom under Latin rule. What remained instead was a bitter truth. The Crusades had now turned against their own. The division between Catholic and Orthodox Christians, once theological, had become visceral, defined by blood and betrayal. Yet incredibly, the crusading movement
Did not end. Even after the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade, new crusades were launched. Some aimed once more at the Holy Land, others at heretics within Europe, and still others at rival Christian cities. The word crusade would no longer mean just a march to Jerusalem. It would become a political tool, a weapon in the hands of kings, popes, and ambitious warlords. Still, for many ordinary people, peasants, monks, knights, the idea of crusading remained sacred. Pilgrims continued to journey to the Holy Land. Orders like the Templars and Hospitallers remained active, guarding coastal fortresses and ferrying pilgrims across dangerous lands. The memory of the Holy Sepulchre, of Christ's tomb, still moved hearts. But after Constantinople, the world could never go back. The trust between East and West had been shattered. The unity of Christendom, the vision of one faith, one church, one purpose, lay in ruins. And in the East, the Islamic world was watching. They had seen the Christians turn on one another. They had seen the splendor of Constantinople fall, not to the armies of Islam, but to the blades of fellow Christians. And as the Crusaders splintered, the Muslim world, still divided, still fractious, began to look ahead, because the Crusades were not over, and the next battles would not be fought in the golden streets of Byzantium, but once more in the dust and flame of the Holy Land. After the humiliation of the Fourth Crusade and the desecration of Constantinople, the idea of a pure and holy crusade, one focused on reclaiming Jerusalem rather than plundering Christian cities, had to be rekindled. And so, in the early 13th century, the papacy once again turned its eyes eastward. The Holy Land remained under Muslim control, ruled now by the Ayyubid dynasty, descendants and successors of Saladin. Though fragmented after Saladin's death, they still held a firm grip over Jerusalem, Cairo, and Damascus. Pope Innocent III, a commanding figure in the history of the Church, attempted to launch what would become known as the Fifth Crusade. This time, the strategy would be different. Rather than attacking Jerusalem directly, the Crusaders would strike at Egypt, the heart of Muslim power and wealth. The theory was that if Egypt fell, the rest of the Levant would crumble soon after. In 1217, Crusader forces began to arrive in the Holy Land, gathering at Acre and other strongholds. By 1218, they turned their attention to
decisive blow, and so, ignoring the counsel of more pragmatic leaders,
They advanced further up the Nile. It was a disastrous mistake. The Crusaders, unfamiliar with the terrain and cut off by the annual Nile floods, found themselves trapped. Supplies dwindled. Morale collapsed. The Ayyubid army regrouped and struck. Surrounded and starving, the Crusaders had no choice but to surrender. In 1241, they were forced to abandon Damietta and retreat, their only reward for years of war being death, disease, and defeat. The Fifth Crusade had ended in failure, despite coming tantalizingly close to success. The offer of Jerusalem, once the dream of every crusader, had been rejected in pursuit of a broader ambition, and now the holy city remained out of reach. But a new figure was rising, not a general, but a king. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was unlike any other crusader leader before him. Born in Sicily and raised among Arabs, Greeks, and Latins, he spoke multiple languages and was deeply educated in science, philosophy, and theology. His court was filled with scholars and poets. He was skeptical of church authority, often in conflict with the papacy, and was even excommunicated by the Pope. But he had taken the Crusader vow, and in 1228 he set sail for the Holy Land. What followed was one of the strangest episodes in the entire history of the Crusades. There was no grand army, no mass of knights or siege engines. Frederick arrived with a modest force, more a diplomatic entourage than a military expedition. Yet through careful negotiation with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, who had also offered peace during the Fifth Crusade, Frederick achieved what generations of crusaders had failed to do. In 1229, without a single major battle, Jerusalem was returned to Christian control. The deal was delicate. The Muslims retained control of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, while the Christians regained access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and a fragile grip on the city. Frederick entered Jerusalem not as a warrior, but as a statesman. He crowned himself king, though there was no bishop to bless it. The church, still furious with him, condemned his actions even as they celebrated the outcome. This was the Sixth Crusade, a crusade without combat, led by an excommunicated emperor, and won through
this time seemingly for good. The Latin kingdom was now reduced to a handful of fortified coastal cities like Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli, strongholds that clung to survival through trade, diplomacy, and military vigilance. But in France, one man still believed in the vision of the Crusades with unshakable conviction: King Louis IX. Louis was not just a monarch, he was a saint in waiting, deeply pious, ascetic, and committed to the idea of Christian virtue. His court was devout, his policies grounded in moral discipline, and his personal conduct was admired even by his enemies. In 1248, following the fall of Jerusalem and the call for a new crusade, he took up the cross and led what would become known as the Seventh Crusade. Unlike previous crusaders driven by glory or conquest, Louis saw himself as a servant of Christ. He fasted, prayed, and surrounded himself with theologians and confessors. His army, though disciplined and well organized, carried not just swords and shields, but relics and crosses. This was to be a crusade of righteousness. Once again, Egypt was chosen as the point of attack. Louis believed that striking at the heart of Muslim power would open the way for the reconquest of the Holy Land. His forces landed at Damietta in 1249 and quickly captured the city, just as Crusaders had done in the Fifth Crusade. But this early success masked deeper problems. The Nile was rising, the summer heat was unbearable, and disease spread quickly among the men. Louis delayed his march toward Cairo, hoping to gather strength, but this hesitation gave the defenders time to regroup. The Muslim forces now were not led by Ayyubid rulers like Saladin or Al-Kamil, but by a new, hardened elite, the Mamluks. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, originally captured or purchased from Central Asia and trained from boyhood to become fierce, loyal warriors. They were not nobles by birth, but soldiers by design, and they were brilliant tacticians. At the Battle of Mansoura, the Mamluks lured the Crusaders into a trap. French forces, including some of Louis's best knights, crossed a river to attack what they believed was a vulnerable position. But once committed, they were surrounded. Hundreds were killed. Others drowned in the Nile. Still others were captured. Louis pressed on, stubborn and hopeful, but soon found his entire army trapped by the flooding of the Nile, cut off from retreat, starving and sick. They were overwhelmed. In 1250, Louis himself was captured. The first and only time a Crusader king was taken prisoner during a crusade. He was held for ransom and eventually released, but the cost was high. Damietta was returned. Thousands had died, and the prestige of the crusading movement had taken another crushing blow. Louis did not return to Europe immediately. He remained in the Crusader strongholds of the Levant for several years, working to fortify defenses and negotiate alliances. He believed, even after defeat, that the Holy Land could be saved through perseverance and diplomacy. He poured money into the defenses of Acre, improved its walls, and tried to rally the local Christian leaders to unity. But their rivalries remained. The Crusader barons were as divided as ever. Meanwhile, the world was changing around them. In the Muslim world, the Mamluks rose to full power. After assassinating their Ayyubid overlords, they seized the Sultanate of Egypt and began consolidating control across the Levant. Their rule was fierce and unyielding. They were no longer interested in fragile treaties or drawn-out diplomacy. They were builders of empires and destroyers of invaders. At the same time, a new storm was gathering from the east, the Mongols. The armies of Genghis Khan and later his grandson Hulagu Khan had swept across Central Asia, Persia, and into the Middle East, destroying cities and empires in their path. In 1258, the Mongols sacked Baghdad, the heart of Islamic learning and one of the greatest cities in the world. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for over 500 years, was crushed. The shock of its fall reverberated across the Islamic world. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Mongols might join with the Crusaders to destroy Islam entirely. Some Crusader leaders even opened diplomatic channels with Mongol generals, but the alliance never materialized. The Mongols had their own interests, and they soon encountered resistance from a force as disciplined as their own, the Mamluks. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks met the Mongols in battle and won. It was the first major defeat of the Mongol advance in the Middle East, and it marked the beginning of Mamluk dominance in the region. From that point on, the Crusaders faced not fractured Muslim dynasties, but a centralized, powerful, and militarily elite state centered in Cairo. The Mamluks saw the Crusader presence not as a threat to be managed, but as a disease to be eradicated. Louis IX would eventually return to France, but his heart remained in the East. In 1270, in his final years, he launched one last crusade, this time to Tunis in North Africa, hoping to convert the local ruler and use the port as a base for a new Eastern campaign.
But disease struck again. Louis died there in the heat and dust, far from Jerusalem. He would later be canonized as Saint Louis, the most revered of all Crusader kings. Not for his victories, but for his sincerity and devotion. His death marked the end of the Great Royal Crusades. What followed would be final efforts, desperate and doomed to hold on to the last pieces of a dream that had begun 2 centuries earlier. The age of the Crusades was nearing its end. As the 13th century drew to a close, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land had become a shadow of its former self. The once mighty kingdom of Jerusalem was gone, replaced by isolated coastal cities, barely held together by foreign support and fragile alliances. Cities like Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli stood as the last outposts of Latin Christendom in the East, islands of European power in a sea of increasingly hostile territory. The Muslim world, once fractured into rival dynasties, was now unified under the ruthless and disciplined rule of the Mamluks. Having defeated both the Crusaders and the Mongols, the Mamluks emerged as the dominant military and political force in the Eastern Mediterranean, and unlike earlier Muslim leaders, who had at times tolerated Crusader enclaves, the Mamluks saw them as invaders who had long overstayed their welcome. In 1289, they captured the city of Tripoli, one of the last Crusader strongholds. It fell quickly, and with it, the county of Tripoli, a Crusader state that had lasted for nearly 180 years, was erased from the map. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Churches were razed, walls torn down. The road to Acre was now wide open. Just 2 years later, in 1291, the Mamluks turned their full might against Acre, the last major Crusader city. The siege was brutal.
Defenders fought from towers and battlements with the desperation of men who knew there would be no retreat. The city had once thrived with merchants, pilgrims, knights, and
monks. Now it was a fortress surrounded by fire and fury. The Mamluks breached the walls, and what followed was slaughter. The defenders were overwhelmed. Civilians were cut down or captured. Monks died beside knights. Churches burned. The sea ran red, and the dream of Christian rule in the Holy Land ended, not with a treaty, but with blood and fire. With the fall of Acre, the Crusader states in the Levant were no more. Those who survived fled by ship, many returning to Europe in shame and silence.
others scattered to Cyprus, the last remaining Crusader stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean, which would survive a little longer as a trading post and a naval base. But the grand project of retaking and ruling the Holy Land, the central mission of the Crusades, was finished. And yet, in many ways, the crusading movement did not truly die. It evolved. In the decades that followed, the term crusade would be used to describe a wide array of conflicts that had little to do with Jerusalem. Crusades were launched against heretics in Europe, such as the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, which turned swords on fellow Christians who rejected the authority of Rome. Crusades were declared against pagans in the Baltic, especially in Prussia and Lithuania, where military orders like the Teutonic Knights sought to convert or conquer local tribes. Crusades were even called against Christian kingdoms that defied papal authority. The Holy Land faded, but the idea of sacred war remained. And yet, the Crusades left behind more than ruins and stories of conquest. They reshaped the world. They opened new trade routes between East and West, even as they fought to dominate the regions they passed through. Spices, silks, and ideas flowed more freely after the Crusades. So too did knowledge. From the Muslim world, Christian Europe gained access to texts on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Arabic numerals, Greek classics preserved by Islamic scholars, and advances in navigation found their way westward. The Crusades also transformed the Catholic Church. The papacy, which had claimed spiritual supremacy over these wars, found its authority stretched thin by failures, politics, and disobedience. Crusading orders like the Templars grew wealthy and powerful, sometimes even rivaling kings, until they were accused of heresy and dissolved in scandal. Culturally, the Crusades shaped how Christians and Muslims saw one another. Hatred, mistrust, and misunderstanding became entrenched.
The interaction through conquest left deep wounds to many in the Muslim world. The Crusades were remembered as brutal invasions justified by religious zealotry. To many in Europe, they became a nostalgic memory, romanticized in literature, legend, and chivalric tales. The very idea of a crusade, of a righteous war sanctioned by heaven, would echo into modern times, used to justify causes both noble and terrible. But perhaps most enduring of all was the story itself of knights and kings, of saints and sultans, of deserts crossed and cities lost and found again. The Crusades began with a simple call to liberate the holy city. They ended 2 centuries later with that city still in other hands and Europe forever changed. And now, as we close this long and winding story, we look back not just on battles and sieges, but on the enduring human struggle between faith and power, conviction and ambition. It is a story of glory, tragedy, hope, and loss. And like all great stories, it reminds us not just of what was, but of who we